Hi, and welcome to Finding Your Way Through Therapy, a proud member of the Sightcraft Network. The goal of this podcast is to demystify therapy, what can happen in therapy, and the wide array of conversations you can have in and about therapy. Through personal experiences, guests will talk about therapy, their experiences with it, and how psychology and therapy are present in many places in their lives, with lots of authenticity and a touch of humor. Here is your host, Steve Bisson.
C'est pas toujours facile de trouver une bonne introduction. It's not always good to find a good introduction, but this one's pretty good. Welcome to episode 152. If you haven't listened to episode 151 yet, I encourage you to do so because it was my co-host, Courtney Romanowski. She had a great interview with someone that she felt that was really, and I loved the interview personally, Maya Benatar. I hope you enjoyed the interview as much as I did. But episode 152, I can't believe I'm up 152, getting close to the anniversary, will be with the Mental Men. And you've heard of Mental Men before. They've been on a few episodes. I think we're on like episode number 3 or 4 now. And we're getting a special guest that hopefully he will join the Mental Men on a regular basis. His name is Dr. Chris Gordon. I call him Chris, but that is officially his title. I worked with him on a nonprofit organization for several years. Really, I hope I get to share a story. He probably saved my career, probably saved me. Hope I can get to share that. I don't know if I'll have time because, we always end up talking a whole lot. He graduated NIH College and University of Maryland School of Medicine, residency in psychiatry at Mass General Hospital in Massachusetts. Currently associate professor at the Psychiatric Harvard Medical School. He's director emeritus, worked for Advocates, and has about 50 years of practice in psychiatry and psychotherapy. That's Chris Gordon. Obviously, you know Bob Cherney, you know Andy Kang, you know Dennis Sweeney, and of course Pat Rice, which I believe will be his 10th episode. So it's going to be a great interview, I'm sure. So here is the interview. But first, here's a message from Freed.ai. GetFreed.ai. Yes, you've heard me talk about it previously in other episodes, but I'm going to talk about it again because GetFreed.ai is just a great service. Imagine being able to pay attention to your clients all the time instead of writing notes and making sure that the note's going to sound good and how are you going to write that note and things like that. GetFreed.ai liberates you from making sure that you're writing what the client is saying, because it is keeping track of what you're saying and will create after the end of every session a progress note. But it goes above and beyond that. Not only does it create a progress note, it also gives you suggestions for goals, gives you even a mental status if you've asked questions around that, as well as being able to write a letter for your client to know what you talked about. So that's the great thing. It saves me time, it saves me a lot of aggravation, and it just speeds up the progress note process so well. And for $99 a month, I know that that's nothing. That's worth my time. That's worth my money. The best part of it too is that if you want to go and put in the code Steve50 when you get the service, at the checkout code is Steve50, you get $50 off your first month. And if you get a whole year, you save a whole 10% for the whole year. So again, Steve50 at checkout for GetFree.ai will give you $50 off for the first month. And like I said, get a full year, get 10% off. Get freed from writing notes, get freed from always scribbling while you're talking to a client, and just paying attention to your client so they win out, you win out, everybody wins. And I think that this is the greatest thing. And if you're up to a point where you got to change the treatment plan, well, the goals are generated for you. So getfree.ai, code Steve50 to save $50 on your first month. Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 152. This is great because we're going to have the Mental Men Plus. And what I mean by the Mental Men Plus is it's going to just be the Mental Men by the next time we have another episode. But we have our regular guests, Andrew Kang, Dennis Sweeney, Bob Cherney, and Pat Rice, all back for a third episode, except Pat is on total of 10 episodes now. So he is now my guest. He's my Bob Newhart to my David Letterman. And for you young people, You have no freaking clue what I just said, and that's fine. You can just pretend you go, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. And if not, just Google it. But more importantly, there's someone that I want to start off with a tribute, because this is something that he did for me in the beginning of my career that he forgot probably. And that's okay. And if he remembers, great. But this man, Dr. Chris Gordon, worked with me at a nonprofit organization for many years. He worked there for many years himself. But about 6 months into my career as a crisis clinician, one of my clients that I had seen about 45 days before that, unfortunately, killed his wife. And this is so long ago. There was two papers. There was a morning paper and there's an afternoon paper. And in the afternoon paper, they said, we know who saw him last. It was this clinician, and we're going to sue that agency and that person for everything that they have. And I have 6 months into my career at this point. So, and I drove this individual to a respite, and I had worked hard to get him the services, but unfortunately, he did what he did 45 days later. That Friday, I get a call from Chris, and Chris says, hey, Steve, you want to go for lunch? And in my head, I'm like, I'm getting fired. So I'm like, sure, I'll bring my pager, I'll bring my PDF. And that's how, again, how old this story is. And Chris like, no, you don't need to bring that. Just bring yourself. So we go to eat at a little restaurant that no longer exists on Route 9. And we chit chat. Me and Chris had never had really a one-on-one. We knew each other, but we never had a one-on-one. And at the end of the lunch, he says, where are you going now, Steve? I said, I'll go back to the crisis team. Chris says, oh, I'm going to see a few outpatient clients if I make it. And I'm like, what do you mean if I make it? He's like, well, maybe there'll be traffic. Maybe there'll be some emergency I got to go to, or maybe something's going to happen to us. And in my head, I went, is Chris threatening me? What's going on here? But ultimately, I looked at Chris. I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, Steve, you can't predict what's going to happen in 15 minutes. Never mind what's going to happen in 45 days. We have your back. I will always support you. You did everything right clinically. Don't worry about it. Because he could clearly tell I was nervous. But basically, I continued my career with the confidence that I'll always have my medical director behind me and someone who trusted me and knew I'd made good decisions. So, Chris, this is a tribute to you, because maybe you don't remember that story, but you made a huge difference in my career. So, Chris Gordon, welcome to Finding Your Way Through Therapy and the Mental Men.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for remembering that. Honestly, I don't remember it, but I'm touched that you do, and I'm so glad the good Chris was there for you at a time of great need.
I didn't know there was a bad Chris.
Oh yeah, there's a crowd in here, Steve.
Well, we'll talk about multiple personality disorders later, but how about you introduce yourself, Chris? Maybe people who don't know who you are, maybe you can introduce yourself.
Okay, so my name is Chris Gordon. I'm a psychiatrist. I trained in the 1970s at Mass General. I had the honor of working for Advocates Incorporated in Framingham for about 25 or 30 years. I've had a ton of therapy myself. I experienced a lot of very distressing anxiety as a child. It blossomed again in adulthood. So I've had a lot of psychotherapy. I even had psychoanalysis. I've taken medicine, which I've found very helpful. And I've loved being a psychiatrist because I relate a lot to the people I serve. And there's a quality about it of paying forward that touches me quite deeply. And most recently in my life, I've been challenged by Parkinson's disease for the last few years. And as a complication of Parkinson's or something like that, I was revisited by depression and anxiety. The ghouls of depression and anxiety showed up again. So that led me to go back into therapy. So I'm currently in therapy, and I love the invitation to join the Mental Men for conversation. I'm a great admirer of my fellow mental men, and really look forward to the conversation.
Well, Chris, welcome. And I can't tell you how happy I was. I can't remember. I think it was Dennis who said, hey, Chris would like to join us. And I'm like, yeah, when? And there was no hesitation on anyone's part, including myself. And so happy to have you here. And,
Thank you.
And all of us, I think, at some point saw you in the community and or worked with you at Advocates.
Yeah.
And you're someone who's really well known, not only for advocates, but also for advocating for individuals who probably wouldn't have had anyone else to advocate for them. So that's another tribute to you, Chris.
Thank you, Steve.
How about the rest of you introduce yourself? Now it's going to be boring because, Chris did the whole big presentation. You guys go next. How about we start with Andy?
Hi, I'm Andy Kang. Been here before. Happy to be back. I also trained at Advocates under all these wonderful gentlemen, including Dr. Gordon. And I bet we could all share several Chris had my back stories. You may not remember any of them, Chris, but
Thank you, Andy.
I remember one very specifically. I won't retell it, but just suffice to say, I've never forgotten it. It was also at the very beginning of my career. So I know you've touched a lot of people, even in my brief time training at Advocates. It was very clear your impact on everybody in there. And I won't forget.
Appreciate it, Andy.
How about we go with Mr. Cherney next? Bob, you go ahead.
Sure. Hopefully I won't break up. Wi-Fi has been a little funky lately, but we'll get through. I'm Bob Cherney. I am a psychologist, and I have actually been doing a couple of different jobs most of my career, one including Advocates for 23 years now. And it's kind of hard to believe, but it's been a wonderful experience, and I've loved the people that we serve, and I've loved the people that I have the pleasure and the honor to work with. And I have to say something, because Chris, you always did something that I always admired, especially I think the longer you were in the field, you started saying, maybe we should minimize medicine for some of these folks, in the sense of some people get a lot of medicine prescribed to them, and it crosses itself and it sometimes hurts the clients. So I've always respected that. And, I agree with you regarding how empathy comes from lived experience. I've had a lot of it. Mm-hmm. And I feel honored, and I appreciate your honesty. I always have, and your soul. So I don't want to get too far into this. I really do respect and admire you, and I always have. So, by the way, you're one of the people who brought me in, so I appreciate that. So,
thank you.
Yeah. And I also have a private practice now, and I'm still rolling along. So that's where I stand right now.
Well, continuing these tributes to Chris Gordon, how about we go with Dennis Sweeney as next?
Good morning, folks. So I'm a licensed mental health counselor, and I have a now virtual practice that I see primarily individuals. I would say that my focus tends to be on recovery, but recovery in a broad sense, but a more specific focus on addiction and recovery. And I also run a group, and I'm really glad to be back here. And Chris, I won't recount, but I will reinforce that there was a specific situation, actually more than one, but one specific situation that you really had my back. And I've been grateful ever since.
Glad to hear it, Dennis. What a back it is.
Yeah, in French that means something different. So we'll share. I will share you off there what that means in French. But last but certainly not least, and on his 10th episode, Mr. Pat Bryce.
Thanks. I actually love doing these podcasts, and I was excited to have this reconnection with Chris, because I had collaborated over the years with you and your remarkable wife, Julie, too. Both when she was at Regis, she had me doing some lecturing there and whatever. But it's I've always enjoyed your grand rounds and all of that. And you're one of those. You're one of the few extraordinary psychiatrists I've actually met in my lifetime. There's been a special few that just, I think, really get the human condition really well. And I really loved him. Much like you, I've been in practice probably 35 years or more now. And, and half of that practice, I was in therapy. I was in medicine when I needed it too early on for a lot of the stuff that I was dealing with. And so, it's like I'm not only, an executive in the hair club, I'm a member too, that type of a thing. We take our own advice, and it's your authenticity that has always resonated with me as the greatest thing you give to yourself and colleagues and patients. And I'll say one thing that is not, Chris is not a part of this, but eerily, and I never knew it, is that I had at about a year in practice in a public detox, I had the same experience you had, Steve. It was, an eerily similar thing. And again, the powers that be there was probably my mentor and an AA sponsor, a chaplain at the hospital. We all knew Dick Fleck, that really told me that, she said, just broke my anonymity, didn't I, in public? I'm not supposed to do that. Forgive me. But he was basically the one that guided me through that we're only responsible for effort, not outcome. And if your effort is motivated by your good training and your heart, you're motivated by love and believe you're doing the right thing for people. You're not responsible for what they go out and do. Whatever it is, harm themselves, harm other people. We just do our best with it. But public things like that are difficult to deal with. And I'll just end by saying that without a team like this always available to me for all of the years that I have worked in doing this, I wouldn't have had a chance to really be any good at it, because it's a complicated thing. We teach most what we need to learn. Our patients teach us what we don't know, and it's a never-ending process of gaining more humility the farther we go. So, again, I just love being here. So, thanks for inviting me once more, Steve.
Well, all of you, of course, know that you're always invited back. This is probably one of the greatest groups I've ever been part of. Minus the Rolling Stones, of course. But you're about the same age, so it works out. But all joking aside, prior to the interview, I was writing down, there's close to 200 years of experience among us six in the field. And that's nothing to sneeze at when you have so many great minds. And one of the things that I also celebrate, one of the things that I will give credit to every single one of you, is that we've always celebrated our differences. We didn't want anyone to reciprocate what we were saying all the time. We were willing to have discussions. And to me, that's how growth occurs. That's how a lot of things that will make this humanity grow occurs. And that doesn't mean we need to always agree. We can agree to disagree, but that just means that it just makes us better people, because there's still a respect that comes from that. So maybe that's also my little political rant, because that's what I think is missing in politics too, is the respect of having different points of view. But I think in therapy, we've learned with these six men that, I can't say I've disagreed a whole lot with most of you, but at the same time, when we disagreed, and it was still respectful. So I want to mention that too, because when we think about therapy, we think about a lot of the suffering that people go through. And, I always wonder how, maybe I'll start with Chris, since you're newer here. How do you think about suffering in therapy? Because that's really what we're facing when we're working with individuals, right?
Yeah, I'd be glad to kick that off. To me, where to begin? I guess one of the most transformational experiences for me was when I was in medical school. I went to medical school at the University of Maryland. The campus for the medical school is in Baltimore, and it's in it was then, and I think it still is, in a quite impoverished area where most of the patients were Black and poor, and most of the doctors were white. And the care in the inner city was by and large quite poor. So when I was a medical student and I started to go up, the first 2 years of medical school are class-based, and then the second 2 years are on the wards, seeing people in the hospital. And when I got up into the wards in the hospital, I'd meet these folks who were quite ill and often unclothed, in gowns and stuff. So they were exposing their bodies to me, and their extreme vulnerability was just so moving. And the idea that I was meeting them at this moment, and it became very clear that if I entered that moment with friendliness, warmth, kindness, gentleness, generosity, neighborliness, that the person responded almost always with just relief, reciprocation, and gratitude. And it struck me, and I had a lot of poor white people too in those beds. And I remember putting my hands on this woman. She must have been about 80, old white woman, putting my hands on her body to palpate her internal organs as part of the examination. And I thought, my God, this is probably the first time in years that anyone has touched her body in this manner. It just made me feel like this is a sacred moment, and my opportunity to be in this relationship is a sacred moment, and that feeling has never left me. And I also know that when I've been suffering myself and I've had to go to a therapist or to a psychiatrist, I feel so raw and so exposed and so vulnerable. And even the wrong choice of word can be so hurtful. Like this one psychiatrist I saw who actually became my doctor, and he compensated for this goof by being a good doctor. But after talking to me for 20 or 30 minutes, he said, "Oh, I know several people like you." And he might as well have hit me in the stomach. People like you. And it just reinforced to me the idea that we have to be so careful because it's a sacred moment. And if we meet the moment well, good things can really happen. And if we fuck it up, which is so easy to do, then it kind of collapses. So maybe I would just offer that as an idea to kick off the conversation.
I turn to you guys. I look, Pat wants to talk, so let's go. Go ahead, Pat.
I couldn't have said it better myself the way I feel it. Everything we do is sacred. The amount of privilege I feel when people share things, and when someone looks at you and says, "I don't believe I've ever told anyone else that." And I was trained simply that it's going to be, after a while, it's hard to tell you something you haven't heard before or some version like it. And part of that is just validating that they're not as bad as they feel. I trained a lot of advocates, triage clinicians in my role with interns and psych triage, emergency room triage. And I would tell anybody that would listen to me and the student that you're going to often meet people and their family members on the worst day of their lives. Or at least that's how it feels to them. And that's a sacred opportunity, but also it is a tremendous responsibility. And that's why we need so much support and help with it. But suffering is, I'm Buddhist by nature, and the root of all suffering is desire. And often, like when you're talking about the medical school, people just desire to be well or not sick. We've all met people that all they want, what drives their entire being, is to try not to feel sick. Now, often their strategies are compounding their problem, like with addiction and things like that. But they're trying to avoid feeling awful. And our job often is to let them know that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, but the ticket for that is some discomfort. There's I remember early on in the addiction business, you used to say, just get sober, everything's going to be great. No, you're going to feel like crap for a long time. I know that. My first year sober was the worst year of my life. Best in retrospect, as far as the connections I made and all of that, but it was not a happy time. It was awful, and I wouldn't have gotten through it without clinicians. An extraordinary psychotherapist that I saw for 17 years saved my life. I think she was amazing, and so I get emotional about that because it's one of the things I had to learn in practice is that it's okay to show your emotion. When people are telling you something that is just heartbreaking, I'm not above just reflecting that. And I think, as Chris said, and then I'll end, is that's part of how I show them some real empathy, is that their story is so moving to me that I just show that. I'm authentic with that. And that's one of those moments when I think we are meeting heart to heart, not head to head. Psychiatry is not about the psyche. I think it's about the heart. And that's how we help to heal, is to just be authentic with our own humanity. So that was a perfect place to start, I think, Steve.
I agree. And, I'm just going to mention the other thing that a lot of you have done in this, they give everyone here tribute to, also is you always, all of you, encourage me to be authentic. And for me, sometimes it looks like, hey, that's fucked up because something fucked up happened to someone. And you say it. And then there's times where I'm like, after the story is done and we've done a little bit of therapy, I'm like, I have tears in my eyes just listening to your story. And that authenticity has taken, like when someone last week asked me, what's your success in your private practice? Authenticity. You can't fake you. So I just want to mention that because I give a lot of credit to everyone here because as you've seen probably since you've known me, and for those of you who listen to podcasts regularly, there's never going to be a fake Steve on here because I can't fake Steve. And that's something that you're absolutely right. Clients respond to that more than they respond to, tell me more about that. And working in the ER, Chris would even, like, once in a while when I would go to, oh, this is straightforward, blah, blah, blah. Chris would be like, no, slow down. Let's look at the whole story. Let's look at the whole family. And Chris would be always very good at calming me down. I didn't appreciate it all the time at 2:00 in the morning. I'll be perfectly honest with you. But when he started talking about the suffering of the family and what the impact will be if I send someone to Holyoke, Massachusetts, when they live in, we'll say, Plymouth, is a huge burden for that family. And Chris would talk me off of doing that. And if you know Massachusetts, that's opposite ends of the states. So I want to mention authenticity and what he brought to my experience in the ER, despite at 2 a.m. sometimes going, come on, Chris. I would be like that a little bit, but ultimately he reminded me of all those things. I'd love to hear from you, Andy, a little bit more about that suffering and therapy and authenticity and everything else we just talked about, because I think it's an important conversation.
All of it right now. There's so much there. It's such a deep topic. Steve can't be faked. We have tried and failed repeatedly. But yeah, suffering to me is an essential part of our job, is to help people with that and walk with people through it. It's present in every day and every session that we do. And most people, I think, try to avoid it. And to Pat, one of your points about discomfort is that, well, we have to acknowledge it. We have to do something with it and find the piece or the lesson within it, because it's telling us to do something. It's telling us to pay attention to something. But that most people do not react to suffering by embracing it and asking for more or digging in deeper. So I feel like that's an important part of our job. One comment to just ping pong off something you said, Chris, about your great therapist who let you down initially. One of the things I try to tell people in my own pithy way is to say that suffering is not relative. Everybody's suffering is their own. It's a subjective experience, and you cannot compare it to anyone else. And so each person gets their own version of it and gets their own story, their own narrative to tell. Yeah. We're there to receive that narrative and reflect back potentially the parts that we see in it or the parts that we relate to, as you guys were saying, and making that connection with the person can ease the suffering. It doesn't, I always talk too about, we're not getting into the circumstances or the facts of what you're talking about that brought you here and brought us to this conversation, as much as we're talking about what's going on underneath that all and why the suffering is what you feel apart from the circumstances. So I've been trying to separate those two things so we can get to what's really going on with the person, and not what are they doing so much. But when I get into that with someone, it's hard not to take on pieces of that also. It's hard not to suffer yourself, as you're listening to people and working with them and empathizing. But I think that's also a bit of the job. That's one of our skills, is to be able to do that with other people. And I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for that I can manage that every day and still come back for more, because and I guess where the reward is seeing people get relieved of suffering, is seeing people work through it and come to terms with it, because they're not usually alleviating it completely. They're not banishing it from their lives and becoming happy or everything's great after that. It's just, well, we can accept it and we can move forward. That's how I look at it.
I think that you have your wand, and you right in the top left drawer that you pull out when people want to feel better.
Yes, that's
All right,
it.
you're the one. I knew there was one of you. But no, I think it's good points. All joking aside, being able to sit there and listen to what's inside, because the subjective of what happened on the outside is not as important as how you feel, leave it inside. My current therapist almost barely listens to what I say. And what I mean by that is, like, where are you feeling it in your body? He does it's, and he always makes me come back to the body. It's a good Buddhist practice, a good meditation practice, and it's certainly something that really helps me too, because he's like, it doesn't matter what the facts are, because it's subjective in many ways and it's your own view. But where are you feeling it? How does it feel? How do we breathe out that stuff? And I know that's a little metaphysical for some people, but I truly appreciate Joe. So shout out to Joe, who doesn't listen at all to the podcast. Dennis, I think that one of the other parts too, that we talked about, joining with our clients, and we got, I want to let you talk, but it's also interesting because I always think about one of the most boundaried therapists I've ever met in the most respectful fashion is you, Dennis. And I'm sure that plays a factor too.
Boundaries are important for all of us. And I think one of the things that is most important is being able to get across to folks that we sit with that we're willing to sit with them and tolerate their suffering, but also at the same time to stand up to it. And I have to say that in thinking about this, each one of us has been available to the other's suffering at some point in time. And that's important, because part of when we stand up to the suffering, when we engage the suffering, some of it gets inside, and we need to have ways to be able to help ourselves to move through that ourselves. And that's, I think, part of the authenticity, but it's also part of the boundary, and recognizing that there is so much that we can tolerate, and then we need to recognize that we need to be able to empty it. So I think that there's different aspects to this dynamic of suffering, because it's a mutual process. It's a mutual therapeutic process.
Can I just say really quickly, I think what Steve said about you, Dennis, that characterization of you as very boundaried, very present. I've had the privilege of working beside you with a couple of clients, and that's absolutely stone cold accurate about you. Your steadiness, your presence, your unwavering commitment to the process. It's very inspiring.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah. Again, you've provided the same for me.
Thanks.
For those of you who might be walking into this conversation, this is not a mutual admiration club, but a sincerity. It's a sincerity club, because I think that this is the stuff that, even if you saw most of us work together 10, 15 years ago in the same environment, would have been a similar conversation, maybe not as flowery in some ways, but at the same time, we were like, that how I've characterized my relationship with Chris and Bob and Dennis and Pat and Andy is that it's respect. And it's also being able to bring in a little goofiness, a little bit of what comes with the work that can be difficult, but also having that space, because the suffering that we go through, and I think, Dennis, you make an excellent point. There's a cartoon that you'll see on some social media where someone always puts their hand on someone who's suffering, and the black of that individual goes on to them and goes on to them and goes on to them until they're all black. And how therapy is, and also having self-care and doing things for ourselves, removes that from us constantly carrying that. Because the suffering, is shared. I mean, we learn empathy, but it's hard not to have sympathy also when you have so many people with suffering. And I don't know what your experience is, Bob, but I'd like to hear more about it.
Well, I think you've all made some wonderful points. I agree with all of them. And the sacred moment idea is something I'm aware of in most sessions, and especially when people say, I've never told this to another human being. And it's happened so often. And when I supervise some of the younger people coming into the field, they'll say that, you know what this person said to me? They said to me, I'm the only one they've ever told that to. And I said, you're going to hear that many times in your career. And it is a sacred moment. When I was younger, wise old therapist of mine said, there's three things you need to build for the therapeutic alliance. And Chris, you encapsulated this when you were talking. You want to make the person feel safe, respected, and understood. And those three things, safe is something that I think some of us don't understand how deep that can be. You know, we talked about the boundaries, but the authenticity is the counterbalance to that. And I think that those two things play off each other. You know, we can be boundaried, but we can also be extremely authentic. And people know that, they can feel it. And that's one of the ways I think we hold clients in a caring way, by being authentic, understanding them, and trying to help them walk through the, you know, their trauma, whatever it is. And we have to meet them where they are. Everyone is different. I've always been struck with how some people will walk in and they'll say, I've got this horrible problem. My printer went down yesterday. And I had somebody say that, and I said, well, how's the rest of your life? And he goes, I don't have any problems. And that was one extreme. And then you've got people that come in with horrific lives, that they've suffered so much. But I think we need to meet them both where we are, where we have to let them know we're with you, we care, and let's see what we can do to read the signal that is your suffering, learn from it, and then kind of move on. How do we make it different? How do you make it different? And what do you have to do without judgment or shame? I mean, I think that, Chris, you were saying it, sometimes just a word or two can be really damaging, and you can see it in the person. I mean, if you're paying attention, you see it, the person,
Right,
and you feel it. And so, and I think sometimes I'll often say, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is what I'm observing, or this is what I'm seeing, or this is what it feels like. And I really give a lot of, I think I was going to use the word power, but I think it's just trying to help the client realize they do have something important to say. I want to hear it. And it is something that's worthwhile. I'm a big fan of the two theories of attachment theory and of self-psychology. And so a lot of my stuff, Dennis, when you were talking, or I guess it was Steve saying, at 2 a.m., Chris wants to go into what's going on with the family. The family's critical. Mm-hmm. And I think it took me, we have people that are coming into the clinics all the time with CBT, which is a great theory and a great practice. Don't get me wrong. But the family and the situations that are part of growing up, they shape the person. They develop the person, and they also will impact their relationships for the rest of their lives. And some of it's wonderful, and then some of it's pretty horrendous. So just I'm a fan of that. So I try to allow the individual to be themselves. I need to have the courage to step into their suffering with them, and I also feel like I do what I can to give them hope.
Well, I think that when you talk about CBT, I mean, that's my education. What are you doing, man? It's throwing everything off.
It's fine.
But all joking aside, I think none of us use one theory. And I think that's a little bit of the misnomer that happens a lot with people leaving school now, because I don't use CBT exclusively. In fact, there's days I don't use it at all. And I think that a little bit of that, we can go into theory as we want, because self-psychology, I think that if we have another episode in us, I think that a lot of people want to hear about self-psychology, because it's not something we've touched on here and there, but I think it's something that people could really benefit from. But again, not singularly. One of the things I talked about suffering, and I want to throw a little spirituality in that. Pardon my old, I'm like Pat. I practice Buddhism principles, and one of the things that life is suffering is part of it, and suffering is due to desire, and it takes time to go through it. And part of our job, and I think to put in a Christian belief, is walk through the valley of darkness. And part of what our job as therapists sometimes is to hold that hand through the valley of darkness. And I'm not trying to make it religious, but there's a spiritual journey that goes with that in the suffering, because most people, I joked around with the wand, but I've recently had a couple of people like, I'm not feeling any better. Yeah, you're right. 3 weeks for 20 years of trauma. You're right. I'm not that good. And trying to explain that the suffering is not something that we want them to get rid of quickly because we need to walk through that suffering in order to get to the other side. I don't know, Pat, I'm turned to you because I turn to a lot of like spirituality around here and we have similar thoughts, but I want to hear more about that whole process because it's suffering is not like, oh, Chris has, no, I don't have the wand, but Andy does, or Chris does, or Dennis does, or no, none of us do. And it's walking through that suffering. Sometimes that's the hardest part for some people because they've suffered for so long.
The fountain of youth is to keep your legs as strong as possible, I believe, and to always stay curious. And in the last 10 years, I've been shifting away from traditional practices to energy work and the quantum frequency healing, which is where our field is going in the next generation's lifetime. But it's really amazing and to see that. And so I focus a lot on the energy. You know, we all speak to that. Is that what is emanating? What are you experiencing in the connection to the person, the patient, the client? I was trained by Dennis in the late 80s. Dennis was my initial intern supervisor. And I still channel Dennis. When it's all hitting the fan, I actually see Dennis's face. I really do. Which some of his patients can tell you that I've known or referred that I can do Dennis really well. I won't do it here. But it's because it's gotten me through. When I don't know what to do next, either Dick Fleck or Dennis comes into my mind because I've watched them for so much. But Dennis impressed upon me a lot. But it was, since I co-led a lot of groups with Dennis, it was the process of silence and being. And we were trained by someone in those days that once said that the difference between a smart therapist and a wise therapist is a smart therapist knows what to say and the wise therapist knows when not to say it. And Dennis, that was Arthur Saramarcoli, I heard say that. And he, but this process of just silence, and when I use that now, I do it a lot, and is to just feel what I'm feeling from the person and focusing a little bit on the energy. And recently I came across a remarkable psychosocial, sociological study in the energy quantum healing field that had to do with measuring the energy that we give off and its impact on other people. And they thought that their hypothesis going into this experiment is that when someone was experiencing a loving feeling, that would be the most impactful feeling on another person. Not even close. 500 times more strongly than love, which is supposedly what motivates so much of human interaction. 500 times stronger was authenticity. When you projected authenticity, you connected with the other person. And boy, that just resonated with me as to everything I'd experienced. And all of you have spoken to that when you're sitting. When I don't know what to do next, I just sit and I take a deep breath and I just try to reflect, compassion, the concept of compassion at that moment, where you don't know what to do next. So don't do anything. Just be with the person. And sometimes I just breathe with them. I've done that more than anything. When I don't get into CBT in that moment, I just say, let's breathe, because they're hyperventilating, they're not breathing and all of that. And let's just get connected to the breath. And then often it happens. A 5-year-old boy who sat in with his mother once said when she was having a meltdown, he came up, put his hand on, she's sitting on the dash, her running board of her car or whatever. And she said, "It's okay. Pat Weiss says it's good to cry," which is my favorite therapeutic comment. But he said he heard that, and he knew in his heart of hearts that was true. It made him feel better. So I think authenticity is so much a part of how I practice, and I think we all do it intuitively. I would love something around, I'll end with the self-psychology, because I can still remember Bob and Dennis and I and many of the folks in the days of Leonard Morris doing a cohort, the self-psychology work study or study group. It was fabulous. It formed so much of my orientation to the process.
I have an idea for merch for the mental men. I would like to have a T-shirt that says, "Pat Rice says it's okay to cry."
Pat Weiss.
Copyright,
So,
copyright, right away.
so we need a merch option.
That's perfect. Bob had,
Next
remember the
level,
t-shirts,
Steve.
the no whining t-shirts back in the day?
Right.
Yeah. With one
No,
of
but
the
I'd also like to
transition.
have a hat that Pat Rice says it's okay to fly.
Hats,
Right.
t-shirts,
Oh.
hoodies. I mean,
Mugs.
we got it.
Oh, that's beautiful. Oh, geez.
Andy, you wanted to say something before
I just
we
want
came up with this great idea to market all this stuff. This is great. I'm copywriting all of it right now.
yeah, I don't want to quash your economic podcast success here, but I'm touched by the story, Pat, and it's not surprising to me that a child is more connected to suffering and the healing of that suffering than the adult, because they're closer to it. They're not afraid of it. They're not running. He's not running from it. He's trying to get his mom not to run from it. Yeah, there's speaking of wisdom, you look backwards to get more of it sometimes in age.
Well,
Great point.
I think that's one of the things is that we learn to change how we interpret things as we get older, and we think we're being intellectual when in all reality, what we do as work, I think sometimes is to get back to the basics. Because I think that when people ask me about emotions, and you guys know I work with first responders, they always go, I don't know. Well, I have the wheel of emotions, and I'm like, here, hold it and look at it and find out at least 3 of them. And literally they go back to, really, I'm just sad. I'm like, yeah, exactly. Getting back to the basics and the basic emotions is sometimes the best thing you could ever do for individuals we work with.
Just a quick comment on that with Andy. I think you're exactly right. And part of the issues around trauma, we do a lot of trauma work at the clinics, and it happens in the private practice, but people they actually get trained on how to survive, period. And some of that has to do with putting on the armor. Some of that has to do with letting go of your expectations around yourself. Some of it has to do with how that you're not worthy of love, so why expect it? There's a whole lot of things that people get trained in, but the little boy, Mom, I don't know if I can do it with Bugs Bunny, but Pat Wright says not to fly or whatever. The children are really not quite, they're not encapsulated yet unless they have horrible the first few years. But it's a really good point.
And the thing that happens, I know that some of you are EMDR clinicians. How many times do I do EMDR and someone like in this 5th or 6th session of EMDR says, I never told anyone about this, but now I feel like I can process this. And they tell you something that they've never said to anyone before. And that's the privilege of the suffering that we open up for people. And I'm not going to get into too much EMDR definitions of opening the channels and stuff like that. But ultimately, I think that, the suffering is exactly the work that we do. And if we can get back to the basics, as you said, Andy, and, it's okay to cry, copyright and pending. I think that it's so important to remember that. And for me, I think that I'll add to this as we wrap up here, because we're already close to the time. And one of the things I want to wrap up with is it's okay to cry is also, it's okay to laugh. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to have all that, because we're complex individuals in that way. And for me, as you said, you try to break me, Andy, and a lot of people have, and it hasn't happened yet. I use humor not only to lighten up the mood, but also to point out the absurdity of life sometimes. And I think that that's important in all our work, to also make our clients laugh, because laughter has a lot of good neurological processes that helps individual kind of process even faster what we have to do. But as we wrap up here, you know what, Chris, you were afraid that we only talk about your subject. I told you, Pat just takes us to the left field and we just come back. Yeah, and I think that we have a lot more to talk about. We talked about psychology. I think that we need to talk about healing and therapy, because we didn't even really talk about that. I would love to have you all back soon, probably sooner rather than later. And one of the things that I also want to make sure you understand is, from the bottom of my heart, I love all of you. And that's one of the things that I've learned in my career and in my life. I don't take love for granted. And I can't tell you how much I love all of you. And I can't wait to see you on the golf course.
Thanks, Steve. Love all you guys.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah.
Sounds
All right.
great.
So
Thank
let's-
you for
let's-
having me. I'm so glad to join this group. This is
Oh,
wonderful.
gonna join
welcome
us again,
aboard.
right?
Yes.
Glad to have you. We love having you.
Thank you.
Chris.
Thank you.
We just remembered how much we need Chris Gordon in our life.
If I
Chris
could make a
Gordon says
comment,
it's okay to cry.
if I could make a comment about healing, what folks saw today with us is part of the healing process.
Yeah.
And we prove it on the golf course. 4 of us play golf a lot, so it's true. You know, it's a beautiful thing. I so cherish these relationships, and sooner is good for me, Steve. I'm all in.
Chris, you better be joining us too.
I'd love to. I'd love to.
Okay.
This was great fun.
Do it.
Well, thank you guys, and I'm gonna talk to you soon.
Well, this concludes episode 152. Everyone, I can't say all their names again. I'll just say Chris, Andy, Bob, Dennis, and Pat. Thank you so much. Dennis is the only one in me not having a nickname, I guess. But thank you so much. I know we're going to have each other on again. I can't wait to have you back on. But episode 153, which will be my 3-year anniversary, which I can't believe I've done this for 3 years. I hope you've enjoyed a lot of these episodes. But for episode 153, we're going to talk about people pleasing. We're going to talk about how that affects people and how to possibly address it. So hope you join me then.
Please like, subscribe, and follow this podcast on your favorite platform. A glowing review is always helpful. And as a reminder, this podcast is for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only. If you're struggling with a mental health or substance abuse issue, please reach out to a professional counselor for consultation. If you are in a mental health crisis, call 988 for assistance. This number is available in the United States and Canada.